Barbara, that's my simple first question here. I know that U.S. attorneys, sometimes you want to use the press, sometimes you don't. Bob Mueller is a man who does not want to use the press at all. But it's a one-sided fight right now, and if it is a PR battle, does Bob Mueller need to rethink his strategy?
Well, I think it is his MO certainly to stay out of the press. He has been known for saying that the press can be your friend at times, but at other times not. And so he prefers to keep his head down and to do his work. So I doubt he's going to change his ways, although you make a good point, which is he's used to working in a world where the ultimate decision maker is a judge or a jury, and it doesn't matter what the press has to say, and it doesn't matter what public opinion says. In this scenario, when it could come down to a report for impeachment consideration, it very much is a political question and up for public debate. And so is he out of his comfort zone here when he's dealing with something where the political stakes are so high? But nonetheless, whether he's thinking about it or not, I doubt he's going to change his game. My guess is he will make a decision to either persuade President Trump to sit for an interview or serve him with a subpoena or decide to go forward without it.
Look, this hemming and hawing by Giuliani, where it looks like somehow he and Mueller's team are going back and forth, and we don't know whether that's really true or not, because Mueller's team are so mum, or whether this is just Giuliani sort of playing to the cameras. But I am curious, Mueller could end this, as you just said, if he decides, you know what, I'm going to split the baby here. I'll do the subpoena that I know I can win, which is to question him about all of his actions as a candidate. And I punt the questions about obstruction. Is that the fallback scenario here?
Maybe. I don't see Robert Mueller going that path. I think he very much would want to ask the questions about obstruction. So I think the demands that Giuliani's team is making are really quite unreasonable, and I don't see any reason why Robert Mueller would give up on those questions. There's some very real questions here about obstruction of justice, and the only person who can really answer those questions are President Trump himself, because corrupt intent is so important. But really, I see his sit down as President Trump's opportunity to tell his side of the story. And if he doesn't want to avail himself of that in some ways, maybe Robert Mueller just walks away and assumes the worst about him. But if he were to file that subpoena, I am very confident that he can win, unless we get a new Supreme Court. Brett Kavanaugh is someone who has written on a strong executive and strong executive privilege. And so maybe the calculus changes once he comes to the court. But, you know, that case of U.S. versus Nixon, unanimous opinion from the 1970s, seems like the law is very strongly in favor of Robert Mueller, at least as of this point.
All right, Barbara, let's talk about the other big legal drama in Trump world, the one where we have you tethered to a camera there for us, the Paul Manafort trial. You're outside the courthouse. Prosecutors are back at it. They're showing how they say Manafort committed bank and tax fraud. The latest example, apparently Manafort claimed a New York City condo was a second home when he was really renting it out on Airbnb. That allowed him to get a bigger mortgage loan, a lower rate from the bank. Prosecutors say the condo's Airbnb listing temporarily disappeared from the website right around the time Manafort was trying to secure that loan. How airtight? How was the testimony today? How good were the prosecutors today at making their point, in your opinion?
I think it was a very strong day. Today was a prosecutor's dream. It can be very dull and tedious for the jurors and for the court watchers, but the case comes in through documents. They had bank witnesses who are just up there talking about how they do their jobs and walking through all of these different loans and all of the contradictory statements that were made by Paul Manafort. I think a very strong day for the prosecution. The defense tried to make some points by saying that Rick Gates was involved in some of these communications or that some of these statements weren't a big deal, but I think that the evidence really does not support their theory that this is all Rick Gates. We've got Paul Manafort personally sending emails, personally attending the closings, and so I think today is a very strong day for the prosecution.
The fact that the defense keeps bringing up Rick Gates, I mean, is it pretty clear that that's their whole strategy here? It's not Manafort that did all this, it's Gates?
It is. And, you know, Rick Gates is not a bad person to try to pin this on. He came across as a really despicable person and someone who will lie to do whatever he wants. But the rest of the evidence corroborates the testimony of Rick Gates and isn't really consistent with the theory that the defense is trying to pin on him. He's certainly involved in some of these things. He works together with Paul Manafort to commit some of these bank frauds and some of the tax fraud. But you see Paul Manafort very involved. And the testimony of accountants who say that Paul Manafort was deeply involved in his finances and knew where every penny was spent, I think is going to be enough for the jury. You never know what a jury wants to do, but if they act reasonably and rationally, I think there's sufficient evidence to convict.
All right, let's talk about Judge Ellis. It was quite a shock to some. He had a star turn today with a big profile in the New York Times. I have no idea whether the judge liked it or didn't. Part of me thinks that he made the apology realizing that maybe his star turn isn't playing so well. But obviously the apology had to do with a complaint, an official complaint by the prosecution. One, was he truly apologetic? And two, has the judge hurt the prosecution's case with the jury?
So the request of the government overnight was a curative instruction because the judge had admonished them in open court. I mean, really scolded them for allowing their expert witness to sit through the trial, which he hadn't known until he was called to the stand, despite the fact that the government had filed a motion to do that and the judge had granted it. And so they asked for a curative instruction to tell the jury that the government had not done anything wrong. He did that, but he did it in the way that sometimes you see celebrities make apologies. I apologize if anyone was offended. He said something to the effect that I may have been wrong, and so you should set aside my comments made to the government yesterday. So whether that was effective or not, whether you can unring the bell, I'm not sure. But he did at least say that his instruction may have been a mistake and that they should disregard that. Has he hurt them in the case? You know, he interjects his opinion from time to time in some ways in a very inappropriate way that could have a harmful effect.
We shall find out how he behaves next week when the defense puts on some witnesses. And if he acts the same, maybe everybody quiets down, right? Barbara McQuade.
Absolutely. I am told that this is the way he rolls.
Yeah, that's what you hear. Barbara McQuade, I'm glad you're not getting wet today, so thank you. Glad no rain.
Thanks very much.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.